All right, everyone. So in this video here, I wanted to make a response video of Spawnwave's video about the Sega Game Gear and how he was saying that this system was ahead of its time. While there are some cases about this, I personally don't really agree with that, mainly because of this system. Now, I can understand most people not knowing about the Atari Lynx, and I'm pretty sure he knows about this system. So I'm not saying he didn't know about this system. I'm just saying, personally for me, when I'm looking at systems during its time period, the Atari Lynx was really a system ahead of its time. The reason why I'm saying this is, let me first and foremost say this. I personally think both systems are really good systems. Yes, the Game Gear did have better games than the Atari Lynx. I mean, let's just face it. These systems came out around the time that the original Game Boy was on the market too. So you basically had three different handheld systems competing. So if you look at today's market, the Game Boy, the original Game Boy is like the PlayStation 4. The Sega Game Gear is basically, I guess if you're looking at total sales figures, if we're not including the Wii U, the Sega Game Gear will basically be the Xbox One. And then coming in third would be the Atari Lynx or the Switch. Even that's actually a really bad comparison. If we actually go back the previous generation with the 360, PS3, and the Wii, that would actually be a better comparison. The Game Boy was the actually, you know what? Let's go back the previous generation before. Yeah, I keep flip-flopping there. Let's just say during the PS2, GameCube, and Xbox era, the PS2 was the Nintendo Game Boy. The Xbox was the Game Gear, and the GameCube was the Atari Lynx. There. All right, we'll move on from that. Terrible analogy. But anyway, in terms of like sales figures, that's kind of where it was at. You had the Game Boy that pretty much dominated everything. And then the Game Gear, even though it didn't sell as well, it put up a good fight. And the Atari Lynx, while it was a good system, commercially it just didn't really have a chance. And honestly, it's actually kind of a shame too. But I'll get into more detail about this in just a bit. But the Game Gear, yes, this is a good system. It has good games. However, you have to understand that the Game Gear is a handheld version of the Sega Master System, whereas the Atari Lynx was a handheld built from the ground up to be a handheld, to be a powerful handheld. Now, there's two different philosophies here. Sega basically took the tech from the Sega Master System and made it much, much smaller into a handheld form, while the Lynx was built as a handheld. Even though it was a bulky system, it was built as a powerful handheld. Fun little fact though, the original creators that designed the handheld first approached Nintendo. And Nintendo turned them down because while they were impressed with the hardware, they didn't like it that it was going to eat up batteries and it was actually going to cost a lot more. So that was really the main reason why Nintendo turned them down. And they were left with like, okay, where do we go now? Let's go to Atari, see if they're interested. And obviously Atari was probably looking at it, it's like, you know, we kind of need a handheld on the market. Yeah, let's go with them. So yeah. Now, the reason why I believe the Atari Lynx was truly a handheld system ahead of its time. First and foremost, you have to understand one thing though. The Atari Lynx actually came out earlier than the Game Gear. That's right. The Atari Lynx came out around the same time as the Game Boy. And then this guy came out, at least in the US, about a year and a half, 2 years later. So, what's the deal here? Well, in terms of powerness, this thing, the Atari Lynx, on a hardware level, was even able to do things that the Sega Genesis couldn't do. That's right. The Atari Lynx, a handheld system, a handheld system, while it is bulky, actually did things on a hardware level that other consoles at the time could not do. This thing could do 3D polygons. Very primitive 3D polygons, but nonetheless 3D polygons. The Game Gear could not do that. Certainly the Game Boy couldn't do that. There were like pseudo 3D games for both the Game Gear and the Game Boy. But the Atari Lynx at its time truly did do 3D. Now, in terms of release dates on these things, the Atari Lynx came out in 1989, September 1st, 1989, and the launch price for the Atari Lynx was $179 or $180. So at the time, even for that price, this wasn't a cheap system. But even though this wasn't a cheap system, you were paying for what you were getting out of this thing at the time. You have to keep in mind, this is a handheld system that came out in 1989. This thing came out in 1991 in the US, but in October 6, 1990 is when it came out in Japan. So, and the launch price for the Game Gear was $150. So $150 versus $180. So $30 difference. So you're basically paying a $30 premium for a more capable system. And not only that, the screen on this is actually slightly bigger than this. Now, if you've never seen cartridges for the Atari Lynx, this is how it looks like. They're actually really, really small. But I actually have quite a bit of games for this thing. So here's an example. Warbirds. This is a flying game. 3D. Full 3D polygons. I'm not even joking. So, and by the way, both of these systems still take six AA batteries. So both of these systems are battery hogs, but that's really mainly because of the screens in them. But if you're wondering how, oh, by the way, if you're wondering how the different cartridges look, this is an EverDrive I have for the Game Gear, but it's the same size as a traditional one. You can obviously carry more of these around with you than this, but having an EverDrive, it doesn't really matter since I basically have everything on there. Anyway, so yeah, this is just a different size comparison of the cartridges, but anyway. They both take 6 AA batteries. I don't have the batteries in here right now. Oh, by the way, this particular one is somewhat, I don't want to say modified, but it does have the original Game Gear shell on here, but this is actually the Majesco version. When I originally got the Majesco version, the casing on it was actually in really bad shape, but the internals was perfectly fine. So I picked up a second Game Gear. It's like, you know what? Let me go with the original look of it, but with the newer version of the hardware. And I also have that little screw in there too for it. But anyway. But yeah, it takes 6 AA batteries. And that's how it looks like when the batteries goes in. Wait a minute, it goes that way. By the way, when you do pick up any handheld system that take like regular batteries, open the battery compartments and check the contacts in them, see if they're corroded or not, because people have a tendency of just leaving the batteries in and then over time they just leak and start destroying things. But for the Lynx, now this is the second iteration of the Atari Lynx. There was an original one that was actually slightly bigger. It was a little bit thinner, but it was actually quite a bit wider. And there was also a door on the side that you slide the games in. This one, they simplified it, and it just goes in like that. And by the way, I actually really like this design of the cartridge, because even though this lip is very simple, it's very effective. So that's how it looks like, and then you got that lip there. You just pull it out, no problem. But the batteries in this actually goes on the bottom. A little bit of a pain in the ass, I'm not going to lie. A little bit of a pain. Okay, so the battery goes in like so, like this. And goes in like that. And just by the way, you want to put the row of batteries in that's closer to the front of the screen in first, because it's just a little, you kind of have to like shove the batteries inward. So just keep that in mind. So once you get the batteries in, assuming these batteries are actually charged, it should power up. And it does. And there's Warbirds. Let's see. There it goes. By the way, the speaker on this thing gets really loud. Ridiculously loud. Now let me just start a game real quick. And here's Warbirds. Now, obviously, trying to play like this, it's going to be a little challenging. But this is a fully 3D game. Very primitive, but it's a 3D game. Now, off. Now, if I change it to a different 3D game, let's see here. I actually have quite a bit of games for this thing. Rampage is actually really good on this thing. Let's see. Batman Returns, Pit Fighter, Sunrunner, that's another 3D game. All Points Bulletin, California Games, Shadow the Beast. Battle Wheels. Rygar. What game was it now? There you go. You got Hard Driven. Now I know there was a Sega Genesis version of this, but let me just demonstrate this because this is actually still pretty impressive. Now, let me actually start a game real quick. And there it is. And look at that. You're actually playing a 3D game. This is something that the Game Boy and the Game Gear could not do. Like I said, it's very primitive graphics, but at the time, this was really impressive. Now, there were things on here. Let me, here we go. Blue Lightning. Let's say Blue Lightning. Hydra's a good one, actually. But you also have to keep in mind, actually, you know what? Let me do Sunrunner. This is actually a good one. And that's Sunrunner. Whoops. Now, trying to play this upside down is a little weird. Yeah, anyway. So you kind of get the point that this system at the time was really impressive in terms of the graphical capabilities and things like that. There were some shortcomings, of course. One cheapness that Atari did to try to cut costs was the way these things were designed. They weren't really, these games, well, the cartridges themselves wasn't really designed to save games. That was one thing the Sega Game Gear had, because the cartridges were thicker. They can do battery backup saves. These were not able to do that. So every game on here pretty much acted like actual arcade games, or if there were like platformers, or say like fighting games and things like that. Were there fighting? Yeah, there were fighting games on this thing. But they all pretty much acted like arcade games. Even some of the games like Ninja Gaiden, Rygar, things like that, these were all based off of the arcade versions. They're not like home conversion. Well, they're home conversions from the arcade, but they were kind of like their own games. A lot of these games on here, like Stun Runner, Zybots, Pac-Land, Xenomorph. This is actually a really good game for the Lynx. But a lot of the games that you're familiar with that were originally on the arcades, they were near I don't want to say arcade perfect, but they were really darn close in terms of replicating the arcade. Even Pit Fighter. Now, this is not a great game, but I'm just saying, you know, when you compare this to the home consoles at the time, this was really impressive. This is basically like taking the Nintendo Switch, for example. Yeah, I know you can connect it to the TV, but a lot of people use the thing as a portable system. So when you take games from other systems, from the PC, I don't really think from the arcade. There are some arcade games on there, but you know, when you compare the games on the Switch versus like on the Xbox One and PS4, while there are some graphical downgrades and maybe some performance downgrades, the actual game itself is a faithful conversion onto that system. And that's what I'm basically trying to get at with the Atari Lynx, is that when there were games that were on the arcades or on other consoles ported over to the Atari Lynx, they were faithful recreations of those original games. So while the Game Gear did have better games than the Atari Lynx, I'm not questioning that. But if you never thought about the Atari Lynx, here's what I'll say about it. The systems themselves are actually starting to go up somewhat in value. The games, however, are still, to this day, reasonably cheap. That's actually part of the reason why I have quite a bit of these, because a lot of them, I paid just a few dollars each for them. Not that much. And there's actually some games on here I actually need to go and play, because I actually haven't tried them yet. So like this one I want to play. I actually might play this after I'm done filming this. But you got Pinball Jam, Turbo Sub, that's another good one. Electro Cop, that's a good one. Rygar, this version is actually based off of the arcade version. Same thing with Ninja Gaiden. On the Lynx, it's based off of the arcade version. But yes, oh, by the way, before I end this, there were 3 primary designs of the cartridge design. This one here is actually the original design, which kind of makes sense when you think about it, only because originally they wanted these to be as flat as possible, and just thinking, okay, they're going to carry a bunch of games with them. Now here's one smart thing they did with this, and this is actually something I actually do really appreciate. See this design here? These are all like punched in here, but this is all raised. The thinking is, if you're carrying a bunch of these games together, this is actually another design that they did, but the only difference is they actually added these things primarily to make it easier to pull them out of the system. But this is actually going to work like this. The original idea was you stack them and they lock together, so they're not going to slide around. That was actually really smart thinking at the time. So the idea was, if Atari actually stuck with this, you can actually just stack them up and they all lock together. Now, of course, the trade-off is, you know, you're not really going to know what games these are unless you actually individually look at them. But I understand why they changed it, because, you know, when you use this and you try to take it out, it's not as bad, but having these little tabs here does make this a little bit easier. And then they finalized the design with just doing this little lip here. And there you go. So I just want to make a response to Spawnwave's video primarily, just to let people know that while the Game Gear at the time was a really good handheld for what it was, I never thought the Game Gear was a system ahead of its time. I've always thought the Atari Lynx, however, was really a system ahead of its time. This thing can do things that the other handhelds couldn't do, and in some cases, the home consoles. But anyway, that's just my thoughts. What are your thoughts? Leave those comments down below. Like this video, share this video, subscribe if you're not a subscriber, and like always, have a good one. And if you're not subscribed, please subscribe for me. I really appreciate it, and make sure to hit that bell icon so you get notified. And that's pretty much it. Just on a side note, I was planning on making videos in January, but I decided to just basically take that entire month off just to take a little break, refresh my mind. But now January is over. I'm back in it. Here we go.